All right, so hopefully people are getting tuned in to all of our outreach sites. So thanks you all for coming tonight to our first of the year Autism 200 series lecture. I'm David Eaton. I'm one of the nurse practitioners at the Autism Center. We've got a great lineup of Autism 200 series lectures this year. We've got our transition summertime topics again, and we're starting off this year again as well as we did last year with our kind of state of autism in 2016. So without further ado, we'll get started with our fun format of the evening.
Well, good evening and welcome to our annual State of Autism presentation. I'm Raphael Bernier.
And I'm Jim Mancini.
And we're here to cover the top stories of the past year in terms of research, community, and national news, and to provide a glimpse of what we might anticipate in 2016. Over to you, Jim.
Well, we're going to start our evening in the area of education. And one of the big things, one of the big developments in education this year was a law that was passed in the Washington State Legislature that prohibits the use of seclusion and isolation as a behavioral plan. So Representative Jerry Pollitt was the sponsor of this bill, and some key points that are important to know. Schools are now prohibited from restraining or isolating your child unless there is a imminent likelihood of harm, okay? So what that means is that they have to be using the least restrictive in terms of interventions that might be in terms of a behavioral outburst or disruptive behavior. And they can use restraint or isolation only when the child is in danger of harming themselves or other people. They need to stop using those types of isolation or restraint as soon as possible. And school districts need to adopt policies that are developed to directly target the use of the least amount of restraint necessary. Caregivers will receive notice. So if your child is restrained or isolated for any reason, there should be a formal notice, something that comes home that says this is what happened. And in my opinion, there should be something that says, well, what are we going to do next time to make sure that this doesn't happen again, okay? And very importantly, school behavior plans cannot have that as part of the behavioral intervention plan. So sometimes you might hear from a school that they might tell you, they say, well, we need seclusion and restraint as part of our behavior plan. Your child can't come to school unless you sign the IEP that says that. They may say something like your child's going to get hurt, or we might have to call the police. And all of these are inaccurate and can be prevented by using a lot of positive behavioral supports, doing accurate and effective functional behavior assessments, and appropriate training in the schools. Another area of education that was a big focus of this year was what's called social-emotional learning. And we're very happy to have someone to come and talk to us about social-emotional learning. Tonight we've got Stacy Gillette, who is previously the special education ombuds person of Washington State, and more recently the executive director of the ARC of King County. So welcome, Stacy. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Does that sound, you're on?
Yes.
Okay. So we heard you had some big present at the end of last year.
I did. I had a bouncing new baby come into my life from my daughter. This is little Lucia. She was born on the 29th. Isn't she adorable?
Very cute. And, the hat is really special.
Don't you like that?
I love that hat. So, congratulations.
Thank you.
So, tell us a little bit about the Social-Emotional Learning Initiative.
Sure. Social-emotional learning is a new conversation in public schools that's really exciting from my perspective, working for many years around issues related to kids with disabilities. So social-emotional learning is, the purpose of it is essentially to create schools and classrooms that become places that really empower and support students in learning and navigating the complexities of social and emotional life, right? And it's really teaching sort of the skills that we need to manage ourselves, to manage our relationships, and to manage work. And what we know is that this is a conversation that helps with universal concepts around universal design, so that we're looking at the whole classroom. This is not just for kids with disabilities. This is not just for kids who have trauma. This is for all kids to learn these very important skills for self-awareness and for understanding others and developing empathy. We know for many years the research around bullying and harassment tells us what we need to do to stop those behaviors and change attitudes. And much of the skill around trauma-informed teaching that comes into this conversation is really critical and important. One of the things that we want to see in all classrooms is that it's not just the luck of the draw that you get a teacher or a school that might be implementing social-emotional learning, that all schools have access to this. So social-emotional learning is really it's not really a curriculum framework, but it is something that we talk about in terms of training teachers and making sure that they have good access to these skills, because you'd be surprised, actually, teachers are often uncomfortable talking about these skills. And we know it particularly impacts the conversation around students with autism. And so teaching social-emotional learning skills is really about helping all of us understand how we're feeling, right? Self-awareness is the first step. Helping us be able to manage our own emotions, so self-management, making sure that we understand how other people feel, and that we develop empathy for other people, that we develop positive relationship skills, and that we know how to manage conflict in our lives, and that we talk about responsible decision making. So what are moral and ethical choices that you might make? What are important choices that put your life on a good track? These would all be explicit and intentional parts of the curriculum. One of the interesting things is that the bill last year, go ahead and do the next slide. There's a bill last year that created a social-emotional learning benchmark work group. There's always, I don't know why we always have really long names in education, right? So this work group sits in OSPI, and it has an interesting group of people on it having this conversation about how we develop curriculum around these areas. They are on a short timeline relative to work-study groups, and so by October 1st, they're going to come out with a set of recommendations back to the legislature and the governor about what social-emotional learning curriculum might look like to make it accessible to all students. In addition, there's a new bill that just got put into the hopper in the legislature. There's a House bill and a Senate bill, which is always a good sign that we have both houses thinking about this issue very seriously. And both of these bills will provide for training for teachers, which is a core, essential part of implementing this strategy, and that we would have a study, a complete study, hopefully a scientific study, right? Not just a political or a legislative study, but something that really looks at the research around this issue and how we move the needle on this conversation. One of the probably the most exciting things for me is this conversation around social-emotional learning gives us a nice platform for really looking again at disability and what it means. So we all know that disability has a biological and a neurological place in our conversation. So how, functionally speaking, how does somebody's impairment affect them? But it really helps us also view disability through this larger lens, questioning whether or not disability is really just sort of a function of our environment. And how is it that we can start to work through the structural barriers in terms of policy and practice and attitudes that really stop people from, or disable people from, full social, economic, and political participation. And having that conversation is just so much more exciting, right, than talking about discipline and expulsion and suspension and bullying, because that's where all of our efforts have been going over the last several years. And so I see this as some really exciting change that I hope that you'll pay attention to as these things start to develop.
Terrific. So I think there was one more. Is it the little how to get involved here, maybe?
How would you get involved if you're excited about this conversation? That's a great question. So up here is, please join the ARC of King County if you'd like. We're going to provide a lot of information about this topic in particular and many others that might be of interest to you. Go ahead and go to SEL for WA, so Social Emotional Learning for Washington. Has really instigated a lot of the work in this area and is helping parents understand how they can participate in the conversation. And then make sure you know who your legislators are. Contact your legislators and tell them that you would like funding around this issue. You want teachers to be trained and informed. You want all schools to have this available for all children. It's really a very unique time for you to be talking about this issue with other people. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. That will have some positive impacts on our kids, wouldn't you say?
Indeed.
All right. So on to you, Rafe.
Oh, yes. Well, last year at our State of Autism address, we learned about a major finding regarding a particular gene that seems to be playing a causal role in autism. That study was published by Bernier and colleagues.
Wait. Are you referring to Dr. Raphael Bernier?
Indeed, that was.
I mean, that guy's incredible.
Yeah.
I mean,
That guy way
he's
too much
really
credit.
smart.
Way too much credit. For
Oh,
that
sorry.
guy. Anyway, moving along. This past year, indeed, there were more advances that were made regarding this particular gene, which is called CHDA. Some scientists at Yale University further identified the role of CHDA in the brain and highlighted the key function of this particular gene and its role in autism. And they highlighted that with this very clearly to evaluate figure in their paper as we look at that. What they found clearly was that this particular gene, CHDA, is really a master regulator of sorts. It is a gene, and its purpose is to turn on and off other genes. And many of the genes that it's turning on and off in development are genes that have been independently implicated in autism. So really suggesting that if there's going to be an autism gene, CHD8 is the autism gene. It's the gene that plays a significant role in how other genes and all the other genes that are operating in our brain are turning on and off and affecting and impacting how our brain is developed in structure as well as in function. So let me just talk you through this complicated figure here for a moment, because those scientists don't know how to communicate clearly. What they're highlighting in the top the top part of this slide, we see a cartoon of a particular gene called the POGZ gene, which is a gene that's been implicated independently in autism. And what we're seeing is a cartoon of the DNA segment that codes for the protein POGZ. And so the thicker little purple lines are those little parts of the DNA sequence that actually code for part of the protein. And what they did is they looked at how does the CHD8 protein attach to different parts of the DNA? And what they found, in this example like POGZ, is that CHD8 signal, that the protein attaches to the part of the gene, in this case POGZ, that turns that gene on and off. And so they can see that both in neural stem cells as well as in human brain by looking at actual expression of the protein. So they can see clearly, wow, okay, so what CHD8 is doing is turning on and off these other genes that we already know are playing a role in autism. So it sort of helps us get some insight into what's happening to the pathophysiology. The bottom half of this slide highlights a number of genes that are related to CHD8 in red. So these are all the genes, this little figure down here is all the genes that have been implicated in autism. Those that are in red are those genes that are turned on and off by CHD8, this master regulator, and those in gray are other genes that aren't necessarily turned on and off by CHD8, but are related by a series of connections in terms of protein-protein interactions. Really, again, highlighting this particular gene is playing a significant role in how our brain is developing and functioning, and specifically tied to autism. So why is that important? Why is that relevant? The reason that's important is because we start to understand that the vast heterogeneity of autism, we can start to piece out how we get from, how we end up with this vast variability. Because we see there's many different genes that are playing a role in autism. And why that is important is because we can then start to target and think about, well, what's going to be effective for this particular individual who is going to have autism for a very different reason from this individual with autism. And so we can then start to develop treatments that are specific to that person's biology. And we're really going to start seeing that a lot in the next couple of years. In 2016, 2017, we're going to start seeing some key advances in applying treatments or interventions that are specific to a given individual's biology. In order to do that, then we're going to go back over to you, Jim.
Okay.
In order to do that, what we need to do is to work with lots of different families, to have a collaboration that's between scientists and families, because what we need to do is, in order to study each particular genetic event, we need to work with a lot of different families that have the same particular genetic event. But each of these individual genetic events, like POGZ, are relatively rare. So in order to do that, we need very large numbers of families. In fact, there's going to be a study starting up in March. There'll be a very, very large national campaign that started for a study that's going to focus on working with 50,000 families across the country. The study is called the SPARK study, and the focus is to invite families to participate in a very, very, very large genetic study where they could participate in the study by spitting into a little kit. That DNA would then be sequenced. The genetic results would be returned to the family via the medical provider they're choosing. Now, this is a free service. It costs about $2,500 to do this if you do this in a clinic, but this is a free research evaluation in terms of genetic evaluation. And so then what happens is families then would have some information about the particular genetic event for their family that's relevant to their family, and then they'd be invited in the future, if they were interested, to participate in a particular study that's specific to their family, such that, oh, excellent, we see that there's been 17 families that have indicated they're interested in participating in research. 17 of them have a POGZ event. Let's go see, we've got this particular treatment we think is effective for individuals with a POGZ event. Let's go ahead and invite them to see if they'd like to participate in a clinical trial. So it's a way of advancing our research and moving into targeted specific treatment for individuals with autism. So that study has actually begun already here at Seattle Children's Autism Center. We're the pilot site for this national study that's embarking. If you have any interest or questions, you can give us a call, but you'll also be hearing a lot about this in the national news come March. And over to you, Jim. I'll stop there.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about health insurance and insurance coverage for things like ABA and neurodevelopmental therapies like speech and occupational. After a stellar year in 2014 where we saw lots and lots of changes, our gains last year were a little less impressive, I would guess. We didn't make quite as much progress in advocating for statewide insurance for across, for all families. The areas, the plans that still don't cover ABA are what we call self-funded plans. So those are plans that are created by a large organization, like Children's Hospital, for example, or a place like Microsoft or Amazon or a big, big company. So each of those companies gets to choose whether they're going to provide those benefits or not. So there have been some changes with self-funded plans. For example, Boeing in 2015 was started covering ABA. And there have been some other changes in neurodevelopmental therapies. So it used to be that lots of times families would get cut off when they hit 9 years old, and that doesn't happen nearly as often as before. Though there are still some changes, and I got a chance to communicate with Mira Posner, who's from the Washington Autism Alliance and Advocacy prior to coming here tonight, and she said that to take a look at some litigation that is going to be targeting federally regulated insurance plans. What can you do to advocate for some of these? Well, first of all, you can contact your employer and contact your human resources and form a group at your company, especially if you have a self-funded plan, and advocate for coverage of ABA and neurodevelopmental therapies. And of course, the WA group is always around. They're a wonderful organization, offers information and pro bono appeal support for any family who may be struggling with insurance coverage. And then we'll move on to the Developmental Disability Administration. So now this was a banner year in terms of DDA. For the first time in 12 years, there were significant increases in DDA funding. I see someone doing a dance over here. That looks like a happy dance. So there should be up to 5,000 families who will be eligible for services in 2016. So if you're enrolled in DDA already, it's worthwhile calling to inquire about different paid services like the Basic Plus waiver programs, individual and family service programs, and respite. We could spend the whole time talking about DDA, and we're not going to do that, but I will just let you know that in May of this year, we're having an Autism 200 class where Ed Holden, who is the executive director of the Informing Families group, will be coming and be giving a lot of information about navigating the complex DDA system. Over to you, Rafe.
Excellent. This past fall in the research world, a key paper indicated that prevalence rates for autism had rocketed up to 1 in 45 children ages 3 to 17. Now, this was a study that was done based on a parent report and parent interviews in which parents were called up on the phone. They were asked a series of questions about their child's development, including, has your child ever been diagnosed with autism? The rates in this paper that came out in the fall were hovering at about 1 in 45. Now, this same group had conducted another set of interviews over a period of time from 2011 to 2013 using the very same approach and a very similar questionnaire. The only difference was in that first survey, one of the questions was, has your child ever been diagnosed with a developmental delay? That was followed by a question, has your child ever been diagnosed with autism? For this more recent study, they switched the orders. And what you can see there in the far two right columns is that the rate with which parents reported they had a diagnosis of autism really changed substantially. That 1 in 45 rate there on the far right and more of a 1 in 80 rate from their previous paper. Now, these are also rates that are very different from what we hear about often in terms of rates that are assessed via school and medical records, a very different way of interpreting and looking at prevalence rates. Those we have our most recent as a 1 in 68 rate. Now, what the authors concluded was that really how we're conducting these studies is really driving what sort of numbers we're getting and how we think about what prevalence rates for autism are. But what they also realized was when they actually tallied up the number of yes responses to has your child ever been diagnosed with autism and has your child ever been diagnosed with developmental delay, for their first study published after their 2011-2013 survey, same exact rates in terms of when you combine both those groups as to what their rates were in this 2014 paper. So there's no change in the rates with which parents reported either or developmental delay or autism. It was just the autism rates went up in their more recent one, and developmental delay reporting went down in this more recent. And so this is captured here very nicely in this figure here. So overall, in the decade between 2000 and 2010, there was a small rise in the rates of both autism and intellectual disability or developmental delay when you combine both those diagnoses. But really what we're seeing in that same amount of time is a significant rise in the rates of autism diagnoses and a significant decline in the rates with which parents are reporting intellectual disability, or that there's intellectual disability is being reported in school or educational records. So really the notion might be, instead of an autism epidemic, what really might be happening, the authors concluded, is that really we're seeing a shifting in the way we diagnose and the way we present information about diagnostic categories. And there was another study that was published in Sweden during the same also last year that looked at this from a very different perspective. What they had done in Sweden was they looked at populations. It's a very complicated slide I'll talk you through in a second. What they did is they looked at population rates. They looked at a national twin registry. They looked at entire population from this public registry. And what they found was over the course of between 1993 and 2002, there was a steady increase in the rate with which autism was being diagnosed. It's exactly what we're seeing in the media here, exactly what we're seeing in the United States. But in this study, what they also captured was they looked at the rates of autism symptoms in that same amount of time, in that same cohort, because they can do cool things like that in Sweden, I guess, with these big, huge population-based cohorts. And what they looked at and what they found was that the rates with which autism symptoms were being reported were pretty much flat across that time. Really flat. So we're not seeing any rise in the rates of autism symptoms across all this time, but we're seeing a significant rise in the number of autism diagnoses. So again, if you pull these three papers together that were published this past year, and really highlight that, are we really talking about an autism epidemic, or are we talking about increased awareness because we're seeing similar levels of symptomatology across decades? We're seeing a decrease in other diagnoses that seem to be correlating significantly with this rise in autism rates. That's enough for science for a second. Over to you, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much, Ray. So another exciting initiative that is happening this year is the development of parent-to-parent programs. So there's a bill in the legislature this year that will call for the development of statewide parent-to-parent programs. So we're lucky to have someone here who has a lot of information about the parent-to-parent programs. So we'd like to welcome Executive Director of the ARC of King County, Stacy Gillette.
Wow, deja vu.
How you doing, Stacy?
I'm good. Long time no see.
How's that granddaughter of yours?
Great. I just read on Facebook my daughter posted her belly button fell off, so I think we're okay now.
Oh, good. Now, where can I get a hat like that?
Yeah, a hat like that.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I have baby friends that
know a
I could
knitter.
get hats for.
I do know a knitter.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We'll talk later.
Okay.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about this parent-parent
Sure.
program.
Well, parent-to-parent programs is hopefully many of you in this room have experienced them. If not, then I hope to encourage you to do so. It's a core service that the ARC has been providing for decades that connects mentor families with families who have new diagnoses or who are going through a lot of transition or change and need some kind of social support or need help navigating systems or get more information about something. What we know is that research shows parent-to-parent programs are highly effective in reducing the enormous public health costs related to chronic stress in new mothers. We know that as families can share the load, that the research shows that they decrease in their depression and their amount of anxiety, they get more sleep, relationships between partners are more positive, and that just being able to connect with another parent who can say, it gets better, or here's what I learned in doing this is really phenomenally helpful. And so parent-to-parent support has been provided through counties across the state as there's funding available, and there's a new bill in the legislature to talk about establishing that program in every county in the state and making sure that it has a permanent place in the system for serving families who have kids with developmental disabilities. Or kids who are diagnosed with mental health issues or chronic medical conditions as well. The parent-to-parent program is really, it has an important place, and it's significant in that we have this great Supreme Court decision called Olmstead that I don't know if many of you are aware of. It requires and says that states must develop a permanent, comprehensive system that reduces and prevents the unnecessary segregation, isolation, and institutionalization of children and adults with disabilities. And so having parent-to-parent is one nice little foothold in establishing this state plan so that we start to comply with this decision, but more importantly, comply with the moral imperative to look at how we provide supports and services so that families don't get burned out and so that they get the resources they need. And the interactions between parent and child are healthier. Stressed out parents can't provide good intervention. And so it's important that we get them the resources that they need.
Terrific. So how can we and other parents sort of advocate for that?
Sure. So the two bills that are happening now, again, it's in the House and the Senate, which is a great sign that there's lots of good support for this, for you to be politically involved and understand I can get you those bill numbers. You can just go online, go on the bill page. There's an electronic comment section. You just click, and you can tell your legislators, based on your address, what your experience has been in these programs, whether or not you would support them, and let them hear from you, because it does matter.
One more question. So if a parent would be interested in participating in a parent-to-parent getting involved, how might they do that?
Well, the first place to start could be the ARC of King County, especially for the folks in this room. There are many ARCs across the state. There are 9 other chapters. So if you're not in King County, you can find a parent-to-parent program potentially in one of the other ARCs that exist. And if you just call and talk to us about your situation, we will find you a mentor parent.
Terrific. Okay. Thank you very much, Stacy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stacy.
All right. Back to research.
All right. Speaking of parents, big gains in terms of treatment options, treatment papers that emerged in 2015. The first paper regarding treatment really heavily involves parents. So for a long time, we know that parents are experts in their children, and finally science is catching up and starting to think, well, how can we capitalize on that expertise and provide optimal outcomes for youngsters. And so a group of scientists have decided to look at how can we effectively utilize parents as therapists. And what they've focused on was that many children who go on to develop autism as infants tend to make less eye contact, tend to pay less attention to faces, tend to not respond to their names as often as we might anticipate. And so what these researchers are capitalizing on is that, well, those same particular behaviors, not attending to one's name, not making eye contact, not attending to faces, really provides little for parents to dig in, to attach to then to engage. And what so these scientists did was they looked at, well, how were parents engaging with young infants? And they were focused mainly on families where there was a child that had been diagnosed with autism and there was a younger sibling who was still an infant, and they would study then those sort of relationships. The thinking being, well, these younger siblings of a child with autism are at increased risk for developing autism. And so what they found is that, again, making less eye contact, paying less attention to faces, was really providing fewer opportunities for moms and dads to connect, to start to teach, to try to communicate. And so what Green and colleagues did was they said, well, we're going to go ahead and try to figure out, well, how can we find out and pay more attention to those subtle cues that are much more subtle for a youngster that may go on to develop autism compared to a neurotypically developing child. And so by essentially sending therapists into the home and teaching moms and dads to attend to these really subtle clues that we would not necessarily pick up on, that are subtle, even more subtle cues and attempts to socially engage, and really building on those. And what they found in their initial work is that, in fact, these youngsters were more engaged, they were exhibiting much better foundation social skills at follow-up after this intensive in-home intervention where the parents were doing all the intervention. The behavioral therapists were simply just providing insight and some examples on how we can pick up on those subtle cues and respond to them. So, very positive finding, and finally science is catching up what we as parents have known for a long time, is that we're experts in our children. Other research in treatment sort of has found some results that were a little different than the parent as therapist study. So about a third of all families with autism participate in are involved in some sort of dietary intervention. The most common dietary intervention is gluten-free, casein-free diet. There's been a number of studies looking at the gluten-free, casein-free diet as an effective intervention for youngsters with autism, and the results are truly mixed. The few studies that have been done are not very well controlled. They're poorly done, and so it's very hard to draw significant conclusions. So Susan Hyman, this past year, published so far the only really good study of the GFCF diet. And by really good, I mean she employed a randomized design. She employed double-blind procedures such that neither the children, nor the parents, nor the investigators knew which treatment they were getting. Were they getting a placebo, or were they getting actually gluten-free, casein-free diet? They had very clear inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria for who could participate. They had very clear variables that they were measuring. We anticipate gains and changes in these particular variables, and they measured them all effectively, again, with folks who were naive to the group status for these participants that were engaging in the study. So what they found was there's actually no change at all at a group level for individuals who are engaging in a gluten-free, casein-free diet. Again, it was the first study that was a well-designed study focusing on the GFCF diet. There are two things that we can conclude from this study. One is that, on average, if you place a handful of kids with a diagnosis of autism and randomize them into groups, on average, we do not see a gain when the GFCF diet is used as an intervention. No gain in terms of social skills, cognition, communication ability. The second thing it highlights is that, well, gosh, as we talked about a little earlier, there's a lot of different, there's a great deal of heterogeneity in autism, and there's a great deal of etiological heterogeneity in autism. There's about 1,000 different genes that are playing a causal role in autism. So we think about putting 18 kiddos into a study, well, you're talking about putting 18 kiddos who have 18 different disorders that we call autism at this stage of the game. And so it's hard to imagine, well, would we expect to see a group change in response to one particular intervention? So again, this highlights the notion that we need to be thinking about targeting treatments that are very specific to a given individual's biological constitution, how they end up with autism. We sort of think about it from an analogy would be, well, you might come in, this is a horrible analogy, but I'm going to throw it out anyway. You come in with a sore throat, and you can have a lot of reasons for having a sore throat. You could have strep throat, you could have a cold, you could have been at the Taylor Swift concert the night before and were screaming your head off, and you can have a lot of reasons, and you're going to treat those all very differently. I treat the Taylor Swift thing by saying, don't do that again. That was a mistake, but that's just my own personal opinion. So again, different treatments. We need to get there with autism. We're not there yet, but we're getting close by thinking about the next slide, which is going to show a complicated cartoon here, but highlights that many of the genes, again, that have been identified in autism, that are playing a role in how brain cells communicate and connect. And many of these have been identified. There's a couple that are emerging very early on as potential targets where we know there's a particular medication that can target that particular protein. The one here circled in red is SCN2A. Now this is a gene that codes for a protein that is involved with how sodium crosses across the cell walls in the brain, which essentially involves how brain cells turn on and off and activate. And there's strong preliminary research that suggests that there is a particular medication that can target this particular gene protein, and so that can impact social symptoms of autism and actually ameliorate social symptoms. Now again, individuals with an SCN2A mutation, as they're called, SCN2A mutations are relatively rare, and so we're going to see this in about 0.25% of all kiddos with autism are going to have this particular genetic event. But it highlights that we have coming down the pike some interventions that are going to be specific for particular individuals. Here we've got a handful, just a handful of many of the 1,000 genes that are implicated in autism, and already we're starting to see that there's particular treatments that we can try to start working on with these particular proteins. Great. Back over to you, Jim.
Okay, thanks, Rafe. So we're going to move away from parents and away from children and start talking about adults and specifically the transition to adulthood. To talk a little bit about this, we'd like to welcome back Gary Stovey. He's the Director of Adult Transition Services at the UW, at the Seattle Children's Autism Center, and also the Director of the UW Autism Center.
Something like that.
Something like that. Thanks for coming, Gary.
Hi, guys. Thanks.
Hello, hello.
Thanks for having me.
So, we heard that you had a nice gift last year as well.
That's right. That's right. Is his picture up there? Yeah, there he is. That's George. That's my grandson. So that's the home disco Seahawk uniform, not with the disco pants.
He's very
so,
cute. He's very cute. I don't know, but that picture just makes me feel sad.
Yeah, something about that it's not seeming quite right.
Yeah.
Well,
Last week it would have
How
looked
do you
real
feel,
good.
Dave?
Yeah.
It's making me a little bit sad right now. I'm not sure why.
Well,
I get it. The Seahawks. Sorry, I'm a little slow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some people watch football.
Yeah.
Others don't.
Too busy
So
doing
anyway,
science.
thanks for coming, and
Thank you.
tell us a little bit about sort of the transition to adulthood and some things that have been happening.
Sure. Well, I think we've, if you don't know it already, the period of time of transitioning into adulthood when kids are exiting the school years is a really time in which kids, soon to be adults, are at risk because so many of the services are embedded into the school programs. And we talk about this big cliff of services that exist right now because there just aren't enough services available to our young adults that are impacted by autism. And so it's an at-risk time. Also because we talked about parent burnout, so we've had parents that are, really performing great work as case managers for their children, and it starts to get to a point where the energy in the system starts to be exhausted. Also, the relationship starts to strain at that age. It's a natural thing that this child that's becoming a young adult is supposed to be starting to become more independent. But that's not always working in both directions. Sometimes the young adult continues to need more support. Sometimes they're able to be more independent, but the parents have trouble letting go. So it's a very, very challenging time. And I think that we have learned at Seattle Children's Autism Center that we really want to not ignore this process. So we really want to get engaged in this process before this happens. So we're really talking to parents, ideally at least by the time your kids get into high school. So we're kind of thinking about entry into high school is a great time. And certainly you can start thinking about transition before that. But it's hard to think about transition at a really early age because kids, it's hard to predict what trajectory they're on. But by the time the kids are in middle school and high school, we as clinicians and you as parents can really come together and we can get an idea of what that future looks like. And some individuals that are bound, let's say, for college and independent living and working independently, what those individuals need is very different from a child that is going to continue to need lifelong support, that might need guardianship and might need services from Developmental Disabilities Administration. So it really starts to separate out. And so we have a program at Seattle Children's Autism Center called Next Steps, which is an educational program. We offer it to parents and caregivers. It's a series of 3 90-minute sessions where we have groups about 5 to 6 sets of parents. And we go over all of these issues with some of our providers that work with teens and adults. And it's a great forum for parents to learn about these issues. So we really encourage everybody that gets our services at the Autism Center to, when your son or daughter enters that high school age, to think about attending one of those classes. I'd say the other thing, again, two things from a state level related to this same age group, this kind of high school age group. One is from the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, or DVR, has received federal funding that is earmarked for what's called the pre-vocation years, so those high school years. And we're not sure exactly where this funding is going to go, but stay tuned because you'll be hearing about this. There are going to be some opportunities for your children in high school to help them start thinking about vocation. And we emphasize having a job not necessarily to be independent financially, but to continue the education process. You know, if I think about when I exited school, I hope I've learned something since that time, and I've learned those things on the job. I've learned how to continue develop social skills. I've learned executive functioning skills, and there's been evidence that's been collected and been published that having a job actually becomes the treatment, that having a job will actually reduce severity of autism symptoms. So it's very important to be thinking about what your child is capable of, what are they interested in, and involving your child in that process, making sure that they're not excluded from that process. We want to see the kids get involved in the IEP process in the high school and be thinking about it, actively involved in that process. And then one little piece, which you already mentioned on with regards to DDA. So Developmental Disabilities Administration has funds available, a lot of them in the form of what are called Individual and Family Support Waivers, or IFS waivers. And we encourage you to talk to your provider, to speak. If you have a child or an adult that's already eligible for DDA, call and speak to your case manager and ask about these, because you want to be assigned this waiver if possible, if it's appropriate, because potentially a lot of services come with this. At the Adult Autism Clinic at University of Washington, a lot of our new patients that we see, we're actually helping families with that process of signing up to DDA, getting the proper paperwork. Because one of the things that happened recently, as you guys remember, there was a change in diagnostic category from DSM-4 to DSM-5, and there's a huge hassle coefficient with regards to getting the proper paperwork into DDA, and we can help you with that. So, okay?
Okay, you know, it's a theme that I'm just kind of seeing throughout the evening is that there's just more funding. You know, we're getting more funding for DDA, we're getting more funding for DVR. The legislature's paying attention to things like parent-to-parent, and you know, there's these initiatives like the social-emotional learning So, looks
We
good.
might start singing "Times They Are Changing."
Yeah, or, the future's so bright. I might need
One
some
or the other.
shades.
Well, thank you very much,
Thanks,
guys.
Gary.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
All right. Over to you.
Great, back to research. Not yet.
Oh, that's a good thing.
Okay, great. So to research. This past year, in the area of neuroscience, a key paper published focusing on what's happening in the brain in autism, highlighted that, well, all the mixed findings that we've been seeing over the past 10 years in terms of neuroscience of autism, well, it makes sense that those are mixed findings because it's a lot more confusing than scientists had hoped. So what the authors of this key study this past year were doing, they were focusing on the idea of connectivity. That is, how do different parts of the brain connect to other parts of the brain? There's a theory about what's happening in the brain in autism, is that autism is a disorder of connectivity. That is, there are certain parts of the brain that are connecting with other parts of the brain and other parts of the brain that aren't connecting properly. And the findings in literature have really been mixed on this. It's been really unclear. Some studies say, oh yes, and see in this group of individuals with autism, we see under-connectivity, and in this study we see groups of individuals with autism, there's over-connectivity. And there's been a lot of confusion in the literature to understand what's going on there. So what this particular study did was, in a very large population, a few hundred individuals with autism, they looked at scans that were conducted using MRI to look at the notion of how do different brain regions connect up with another. And what they found clearly is that there's both over-connectivity and under-connectivity in the brain, much as there is in neurotypical individuals. But what they're finding is that the pattern is a little bit different, such that some parts of the brain are more highly connected that aren't involved in processing social information, and those parts that are involved in processing social information are a little less connected. And so how might that relate to behavior, complex things like behavior? Well, here's the theory, and here's what's going on. The social world is very complex. In order to make sense of our social world, we have to, in a very rapid, very quick, sort of short amount of time, we have to pay attention to where someone's looking, what their facial expression is doing, where their hands are going. We have to pay attention to what's going on in the context. And we have to, we got to figure out what's coming out of their mouths. We have to do that in a very quick way. It's very complex. And so in order to do complex behaviors like that, we need to pull in disparate parts of our brain very rapidly. And so what the theory is that what's happening in autism is that those disparate parts of the brain can't be pulled in quickly because there's not that enhanced connectivity. Instead, what we see is finite connectivity between very distinct, tighter regions of the brain. And so what that might lead to significant splinter skills or abilities in processing visual information very rapidly, that is visual static information, like pulling out details out of pictures or being able to complete puzzles very rapidly. And so there's some behavioral research that seems to suggest and support these neurological findings, that what might be happening in autism at the neurological level is that these disparate parts of the brain aren't connecting, but these tightly coupled parts of the brain are tightly connected. So a lot of enthusiasm for the study, primarily because it was such a large study with several hundred participants. So the neuroimagers could be pretty confident that, okay, we think that this is going to relate to a large, be generalizable to a large group of individuals with autism. More to be seen as we move forward in thinking about these biological indicators of autism in the coming year. Yes.
Okay, great. So we're going to move on to some national news. At the end of 2014, President Obama signed the ABLE Act, the Achieving a Better Life Experience Act. What this did was allowed people with disabilities and their families to set up special savings accounts that were tax exempt for all disability-related expenses. So one of the things that some people were touting this as one of the biggest federal legislation since the ADA back in 45 years ago. Washington in April became the 9th state, so Governor Inslee signed the ABLE Act for Washington State. For our viewers in Oregon, you guys were the 31st state. That was towards the end of the year. And any viewers up in Alaska did not pass the Alaska legislature last year, although it is on the docket for 2016. So ABLE accounts are not currently available. There's been some news recently about the Department of Treasury, Washington State Department of Treasury, going to be providing some information very soon about how families might be able to access these ABLE accounts. So stay tuned for that. In other news, Sesame Street introduced a new character named Julia who has autism this year, and the creators of Sesame Street reported that they wanted to increase awareness of autism and empathy for children with autism in their viewers. And more importantly, for the fifth year in a row, the #1 interest for children with autism spectrum disorder was Minecraft, though we are anticipating a new #1 for this year. Over to you, Rafe.
Great. Back to science, away from that crazy news. In 2015 was called the Year of the Female in terms of in the autism science community. And this is recognized because for years the focus of autism research has been on young boys and men with autism, and there really hasn't been a strong focus on girls with autism. So this past year, there was a strong focus in the scientific community to really delve deep and understand this. There was a journal called Molecular Autism, which focused a whole issue only on the study of girls with autism. And there are a number of studies that are ongoing now, funded by NIH, to better understand girls with autism. Work that was done here, that we did here at the University of Washington, helped understand a little bit some of the confusion around the genetics of girls with autism. And I'm going to talk you through this complicated slide. This is for years, we've been focusing on identifying particular genetic events that seem to play a causal role in autism. And mostly we've been focusing on what we call de novo events, genetic events that mom and dad don't have. So these are things that arise anew, either very early on after conception or in the germ cells, so sperm or egg cells. And so that's been the focus for the past several years. About the past 5 years, we've been focused on what we call de novo, either SNVs or CNVs, or different types of genetic events. Focus on de novo events. What's been harder to understand are particular events that might be inherited from mom and dad. That is a particular rare version of a gene, or a gene that's not producing the protein it's supposed to be producing, and we haven't identified many of those that are passed on from mom or dad. However, we started looking at where do these de novo events tend to originate? Where do they tend to come from? And they tend to come from the dad's side. So they're coming from a sperm cell, or they're coming from the paternal line. We started looking at identifying some events that could be inherited. And here we started to see something very interesting and peculiar. What we started seeing is that some events can be inherited. Most often when they're inherited, they're passed on from mom. And what happens is if mom is carrying this particular event, doesn't have autism. If she has a daughter, that daughter doesn't have autism. If she has a son, that son does have autism. Trying to make sense of, well, there's something protective about being a female alone that changes the outcome of this particular genetic event. So still no good insight as to what that is as of yet. We know that these particular genetic events aren't tied to our sex chromosomes, our X or Y chromosomes, but there's something going on that's protective about being female that impacts the way particular genes that we know are playing a causal role in autism in boys are playing out in girls. So more work to be done on this as 2016 falls over and continues to be a second year of the female. The scientific community is still very excited to try to understand girls with autism, and this work will continue.
Okay, so in our final news story for this evening, we're going to talk a little bit about just some stories about autism that happen from society, in society. There's some heartwarming stories. The story of the young woman who works at a supermarket in Michigan and works in the bakery section and was asked to decorate a cake, and the cake came out in an atypical way, maybe. And but the woman who bought the cake loved it and decided to take some pictures of it. And that story and the picture went viral with lots and lots of support for that woman and the woman who bought the cake as well. There was a great HBO documentary this year that was called How to Dance in Ohio that focused on a couple of young women with autism and their preparation to attend a prom. And then there's some great stories of support. There's the story of the Alaskan pizza parlor who fired one of their customers who called to complain and kind of make fun of a delivery man who has autism, and the owner of the pizza place said, "You're out of here. Don't call here again. You're fired as our customer." And the story of Broadway star Kevin Moon Lowe, who was in The King and I. I don't know if anyone heard this story, but there was a mother who brought her son to the performance, and the son got had a little behavior, and there were some people who were yelling at her and asking her to leave. And he wrote a very nice Facebook post afterwards defending this mother's choice and how to bring her son to the theater, and everyone has a right to be participating in the theater or anywhere in society. And then there's stories of hatred and intolerance. So after the Oregon Community College shooting, there was a Facebook group that arose called Families Against Autistic Shooters, and used the term describe the soulless dead eyes of autistic children. So this was generally derided, and the Facebook group was shut down, and there was a very nice opinion piece by Andrew Solomon that appeared in the New York Times, calling these people out. And so there was some nice examples of defense and support for people with autism this year. And those we have local stories as well. There's a great story about a restaurant owner who followed a mom and her son out after the son had a behavior and said, "What can I do to help? What can I do to make you have a better time next time?" Okay, so we have those great stories, but we also have the negative stories. The story of the boy and his father who would go to a coffee shop daily, and the barista was having a bad day, and he asked them to leave because the son was scripting a little too much. There's a story of a young woman who works downtown and loves to ask people their birthday, and the manager of that store thought it was bad for business, so now she's relegated to the back room, and she doesn't have access to customers. And then there's a story of a community college professor who, when a young man came to class, and he had some atypical behavior, the professor said, "Well, I don't know if you've got autism or ADHD or whatever they're calling it these days, but don't come back here unless you're medicated." So we hear these bad stories. We hear these stories that are verging on civil rights violations. So these stories still happen, and those are the instances that make families feel I'm not accepted in society. It makes people feel isolated and not being able to go out. So, so our call for 2016 is to move beyond what we think of as awareness and move beyond what we think of even the word tolerance or acceptance, and moving towards something that's a more inclusive and more welcoming society where we're actually embracing people for their differences. So thank you very much. Do we have something? I think we got some acknowledgements.
Just some quick acknowledgements to say that pulling together the news from a year takes a team effort, and there's definitely a lot of folks that we'd like to thank for helping us sort of pull together the news for this past year and thinking about what's going to happen next year, and be able to provide that in a format that's not only available for here in Seattle, but for places throughout the Pacific Northwest. So thanks to all the folks we've consulted with and have helped us out with our today, and thank you to you guys for coming to hear us talk about what's been going on this past year. Thank you, thank you.
All right, so we're here. We left lots of times for people to ask questions, and Gary and Stacy, and I'm going to target Katrina over there, and David Eaton, and anyone else who wants to answer questions. You got to move to the last slide, though. It's important.
My slide deck. Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Thank you. That took some work.
Who's who?
I actually have two questions.
Okay.
The first one is Washington State moving more towards inclusive education for children with autism? And the second one, is there an ARC available in Pierce County? Okay.
You want to take that, answer that question, Stacy? Yeah.
Yes, there's an ARC in Pierce County. And if you go on the ARC of Washington site, just Google it, all the county chapters will come up. And for Oregon and Washington, you can do the same, or Alaska, you can go to your state ARC and it'll list you out by county. In terms of inclusive practices in schools, that's a great question. We haven't really defined what that means. And what we know is you have a lot of rights that don't really come to life. And you've got a lot of leverage to have those conversations, but that educators need support to understand what's going on. So much like, the response from the pizza parlor owner who kicks somebody out, or the barista who doesn't understand, there are a lot of people still in the education community who are learning and don't quite understand. And so we have to continue to support their education and give them the tools to provide inclusive practices.
Yeah, and I would just kind of add that inclusion doesn't mean just being pushed into a general education classroom. Very often that happens, and they're not getting the adequate support from special education, from instructional assistants. So if it's going to, we're pushing for inclusion, but it has to work, and it has to be appropriate for that family, that child.
So through the help of DVR, submitting the application, and on the weight of the diagnosis from the psychologist at CHDD's Center for Autism, my 27-year-old son was deemed DDA eligible. And I have given a call, and I think in the next few weeks I'll probably be in contact for in-home evaluation. So those are going through, and I'm very happy for the information I've gotten here and for the support, because he was too high functioning and fell through the cracks as an adult, and I'm glad to see that there's so many good things going.
That's
Thanks.
great to hear, and this is one of our regular attendees who's speaking right now, so it's great to hear some good news.
Yeah, this was really helpful, thanks. What would you recommend while we wait for next year at this time to get an update? How to stay updated? I mean, is there what? Yeah, you understand.
Yeah.
And also, what is POG-Z?
Great. So, two good questions. So, how to stay up to date? There's a number of resources at the Seattle Children's Autism Center for helping folks to sort of stay up to date. We have our blog, which comes out weekly, which is a real nice way. We sort of try to hit a lot of different topics on the blog, and we really want to try to make sure we're providing information that's appropriate, right? If there's a lot of garbage out there, and so we're going to highlight and direct people only to sort of the good information. We have our monthly Autism 200 series, which is going to hit on a number of different topics. Always a good way to stay in touch. Those are probably our two quickest ways to stay.
In other organizations like the ARC of King County, I think the WA group, if you go to either of those websites, there's often updates, especially if you're interested in legislation or insurance, advocating for insurance. I think those are good places to get information too. And Autism Speaks is another. If you're thinking about national news, then Autism Speaks is a wealth of information.
I'll also make a quick plug for getting involved in a research study, no matter what sort of the focus is, as long as it's of interest to your family, because it just provides an opportunity to touch base with some scientists who are more than happy to talk. Probably more than you want to hear, actually. But it's also a way of sort of staying up on at least a particular avenue of autism. So, and to circle back to POG-Z. So POG-Z is a particular gene in the brain that's involved in, again, synaptic connectivity. So the way brain cells adhere to one another and connect. It's been implicated in autism as well as intellectual disability. And when there's been studies of individuals who have particular disruptions to this particular gene, we start to see a very particular phenotype. That is a very particular pattern of behaviors. It's characterized by autism plus hyperactivity, sleep challenges, and sort of indiscriminate vision problems that range from significant vision challenges to just nearsightedness, farsightedness. So more to be seen on that. I'm not supposed to talk about it, but there's actually a paper coming out about POG-Z in a few weeks in American Journal of Human Genetics.
Don't tell anybody.
Sorry, don't tell anyone.
YouTube, this is.
Oh, right. Don't watch
You got
this.
a month
Okay, yeah.
before it's really,
Okay, good.
widely spread.
So that will be the paper coming out in the next, very soon to talk about POG-Z. Great.
So do you want to see if there's any questions at the remote site? So, any questions at any of the other sites? That was Dave's job. Not my job.
Wow.
Tonight. Usually that's my job. No?
Going back to when you were talking about the adult syndrome disorder and the waivers through the DDA, can you reiterate the acronym for that waiver? I didn't catch it.
IFS, Individual Family Support Services. That's on. You can find that on the link that you have for the Informing Families website.
Sorry. I know a little bit about DDA, and the one thing I know that if you've not enrolled, first thing you have to do is just see if your child's eligible. They have criteria, so apply. And then if your child becomes eligible for DDA services and you get that letter in the mail, it might say you're on the no paid services list. A lot of families just ignore that and they stop there. Really, the message should be, that day when you get that letter, call the number on the letter and just say, I'm calling to be assessed for services. And then the ball gets rolling from there. Things are changing pretty quickly. It might not go right to a waiver. You might start off with some funding. If you're on Medicaid, you might get a program called Community First Choice. So there's all kinds of things to be thinking about. Most importantly, get in the system and ask for services and work closely with your caseworker. And there's some really good people over there. It was a hard job for them for 12 years not to give any money out. Now they finally can. So there's really no bad guys. They're just working really hard to spend that money that they got. Lucky us.
Just for this mom, we were on the waiting list for 8 years and we got funding this year.
Any last questions? Maybe another chance for the external sites. Yeah.
I'm just curious, as a parent of a 6-year-old who will someday be 26, right now to talk about a 6-year-old with autism seems to be kind of the sexy topic. You know, people are talking about autism. There's these viral stories out there. Politicians are talking about it. People really are paying attention, but when it becomes adults with autism, I notice the volume goes low. And as a parent with a 6-year-old looking into the future, I'm involved in special ed. I'm in school right now to be a special ed teacher, and I'm noticing that there's a huge discrepancy between the services that he receives in elementary and middle school than on the high school. And I've noticed in Seattle, it keeps getting cut, where even the access program that my son's in now, where he gets push-in services and inclusion education, doesn't exist anymore for high school next year. They're removing it completely. And I know it will be replaced with something else, and by the time my son gets there, it'll change again. But I'm wondering how much. It seems like there's a lot of people, and Stacy, you might be a good person to talk to about this as well. There's a lot of people that are making these decisions on these cuts that have no information about the potential of a person with autism and what their long-term gain is. And even with Seattle School District cutting college prep for kids with disabilities. So if you're on an IEP, you used to get jobs, training, or college prep, and now the college prep is gone. So we're just assuming you're gonna push a mop. We're assuming that you're gonna be able to work at Walmart or be a cashier somewhere, and that's gonna be as best as it's gonna get. I'm just wondering, do they come and talk to you? Do they ask you, what's the potential here? Because I feel like Children's has done a lot, and it's obvious that the ARC has done a lot for adults living on the spectrum and their families. But the school district, for a lot of people who don't have the insurance or the abilities to come to where the resources are, all we have is a school district. So do they come to you and do they lean on you for advice on what can we do to better these children? Because you're putting in the money early, but if you don't continue, you're just blowing it, you're wasting it. And so it just seems it's such a frustrating point for me. I feel so hopeful when I talk to you guys and hear what you have to say, but then I go to a school board meeting and it's like the air comes out of the balloon, and it's just so infuriating as a parent and as an educator about what's not happening here.
The good news is at our school in Seattle, students are taken to community college, so their college prep is paid for through the school system. It's not about you will be a cashier or a shelf stocker. I mean, it's part of the transition program until the last day you're 21. Ingram. Well, it's the Bridges program, the transition program. It's for everybody.
You know, so I think we see a lot of variation from district to district, but I think there is that, you know, that general thing that you see that you know, the kids with autism aren't as cute when they have mustaches, and you know, yeah, and they're bigger, and you know, you see a lot of the teachers that have good educations in how to work with children with autism don't have the same opportunities to be educated in working with teens and adults, and so that's part of our job at University of Washington. You know, working with you know, the College of Education in creating opportunities for the behavioral therapists coming out of that program to have opportunities to work with teens and adults, so that we can see the same change that occurred in early intervention over the past 20 years occur in the for teens and adults. And I think that will happen, but it will take that time, and it needs your advocacy and that kind of continued advocacy for that to occur. I think the other thing that Stacy alluded to earlier is really breaking down the barriers that exist between so-called special education and general education, and recognizing the social and emotional learning that needs to occur across the campus that will benefit our children with autism as well as their peers, so-called neurotypicals. So I think that it's really nice to see that legislation moving through, and I would really push towards the concept of inclusion as much as we can, but not at the detriment of the children's education.
So I can just add, being an ombudsman, I got to see how a lot of districts across the state manage this challenge. And I would just mention a couple of things, because it's a topic we could talk about for a long time. Overall, we have to change expectations around outcomes for kids with disabilities. So the school system is pretty content with the outcomes that we're getting, and we know that those outcomes for our kids are really alarming. They graduate at half the rate. They go on to post-secondary at about 20%. When we do surveys on 1 year after high school, what are these kids doing? The majority of them are not employed. They're not in a post-secondary program. They're at home. So what does that mean? We're doing all this great early intervention, and we're creating all these great expectations, and then somewhere we haven't caught up with ourselves. And that's going to take a lot of advocacy on your part. And so I hate to say it, but as parents, you have to be ever vigilant. And until we tackle this overall issue about the value that people with disabilities have in our lives, particularly people with intellectual disabilities, people with behavioral issues, there's a lot of misunderstanding and stigma and shame around these issues. And so we have to keep working on that. The second issue I'll mention to you is there is a work group that's just ending its work through the Student Achievement Council, and they had a 3-year task to look at what were the barriers and obstacles to kids with disabilities going on to post-secondary. There's a 3 years worth of recommendations in those reports that are going to just sit on a website if there's not some advocacy around that issue and setting expectation. The third issue that I'll mention, and this is, you know, unfortunately the ombuds and me getting into the minutia because I can see where some of this happens. In our state, there's not enough good conversation in union conversations with school districts. The transition teachers are given the same kinds of break schedules and planning time as all the high school and elementary teachers are. And for transition teachers, they're often out in the community, they're working on weekends, they're doing job placement, they have to learn how to interface with employers, potential employers for work study kinds of opportunities. They need a different kind of scheduling. And what has happened over time is that several of the transition programs have gone to 4 days a week so that the teachers can get that 5th day of planning. So they just sort of accumulate it all in a day. Well, that's great for the teachers, but what happens with the kids on that 5th day, right? Nobody said, oh, yeah, kids need to just go 4 days now so that teachers can have planning. But that is exactly what's happened in the majority of districts. And so until teachers get a little bargaining room, and as parents, you push back on that 5th day, what I've started to hear is that the school districts sort of justify the 4 days as, well, you know, your kids are not going to be employed full-time anyway as adults, so they might as well just get used to sort of just working part-time and attending part-time. And my response has been, you know, education is not heroin that we have to wean kids off of. In fact, school is supposed to be there so that child is ready the day where we can offer them employment to the full extent that they're capable. And schools' jobs are to prepare kids for that and give them the experiences in order to be successful. So you have a little advocacy to do because we just haven't reached up there far enough. But we'll keep working on it together.
And the only thing I would add to that would be, you know, most of the change that we've ever seen is this coalition of parents and teachers coming together and working together to push this administration to change. So we have mostly teachers and parents in this room. We have mostly teachers and parents that come and watch us from the different sites. So organize, and you know, as Stacy says, it's some work. We've got to do some work. One back in the corner.
Stacy, is that right, Stacy? Those 3 pages on the website that are going to languish, how do we access them?
If you Google the Washington Student Achievement Council, Disability Task Force. So the Washington Student Achievement Council Disability Task Force. And that webpage will come up, and all 3 reports are on the side, and you can link right into them and look at the recommendations.
I just remembered when I went to the parent-to-parent coffee gathering today, and we had a discussion on trying to get parents together in the same school to be support, and there have been barriers put up now because of privacy issues. You can't find out if there's another child in the school with similar problems with the parents to get the parents together. Now, this was not something I encountered when my son was young, because, you know, we could put a directory, give them the room number, and you list we knew which teachers were the special ed, so we knew who they all were. But apparently now there's a barrier, and I think that's one way to get parents is to ease it for inside the school. And I don't know what you could do if these, you know, HIPAA privacy things are getting in the way.
There has not been a change in the law. So it's just a practice that's come about to the extent that every parent who joins the PTA gets to know about other parents in their school. Every parent gives permission to allow their child to be in the directory and those sorts of things. That can happen. It's no different for your child. It's a policy issue, so you could call the Ombudsman's office. They'll help you sort of work on that issue at your school.
Last questions? Yeah.
We've touched on this. I'm a provider, and we've talked about advocacy, especially in schools. You know, I do early intervention, and there is a lot of new knowledge out there, and I do think people really want to help, but there's a lot of teachers that mean really well, and they don't have the support, and they don't have the education, and parents are being promised, even on IEPs, support, and they're not getting that support. And then the school is saying, well, we don't have the staffing, we don't have the funding, we can't, I'm sorry, you know, all of those things. So I find that there's a fine line. You wanna push back a little bit, but at the same time, I've also been with families where the school says, oh, we can't support you, we'll move you. So any recommendations on how to go about that? You know, I want to advocate with my families. I want to get them the services that they deserve and that they're often promised. But so many times the schools aren't fulfilling those promises. And you're scared to push back too much.
So there are ways to have those conversations without getting a lawyer and bringing a lawyer to your IEP meeting, obviously. And the system itself, I would tell you, is a little broken, right? And we have to be willing to talk about that issue. Right now, we don't have leadership at the state level and at a policy level to acknowledge the problem. We're only just now starting to define the outcome measures that lead us into the conversation that say, well, those outcomes are not acceptable. That kids with disabilities are twice as likely to be suspended or expelled. They're 3 times as likely to be bullied and harassed. Their graduation and dropout rates are significantly higher. You know, our kids are in the opportunity gap as much as any other child of color living in poverty. And we don't talk about that. So we have to elevate the conversation a little bit overall to change the system, because we're just otherwise constantly doing this triage, right? For individual kids, I used to say it's after 30 years of doing this, it's the same problem, different family, over and over again. So there's a bigger issue here. We have a lot of great constructs within civil rights law and the current special education law. Implementation is a little bit broken, and part of it is the shift toward compliance at the expense of communication with families and collaboration and cooperation, and looking at some of these issues. So I do want to encourage you to individually still keep fighting the fight, and you know.
Makes a big difference too, because I have so many families that look at me and go, I didn't know I could ask that question.
Yeah.
Or I get an IEP draft. I thought I just showed up to the meeting and I got the IEP. So I think these sort of things teach families so much, and I think it gets people talking a lot more, which I think is really beneficial.
It is important to go to parent trainings and education. I mean, it's one of the few situations where I know parents feel like, first I got to become a therapist, then I got to become a lawyer to understand what's going on. Yeah. And navigate, trying to get your own respite. Then you open a small business when your child is an adult, because you're navigating residential programs and respite programs and how to contract services for your child. So it's tricky right now, but it's why groups like this are really important, because you're powerful together as a group talking about these issues. Individual families get super isolated, and it's really easy to kind of go, wow, I imagine nobody else is going through this. It's just my own particular thing, but that's not the case. We know that. So we do have in our state this unique thing, the Ombuds Office, who can help you still with individual issues, you know, give you the support to advocate individually within your situation and your school. And then we have to keep having these kinds of conversations so that we change what's going on, because we know we have to continue to do that. We're not where we want to be just yet. So.
Excellent. Thanks everybody for all your great questions and comments. And as we come to 8:30, one more round of applause for Raphael Bernier and Jim Mancini. And have a great evening. We'll see you next month. Thanks a lot.